I'd like to introduce our CEDAW Dean, School of Economics and Business Administration, Dean Zan Lee. He, in turn, will introduce the keynote speaker. So Zan has been very supportive of the center and its activities. So thank you, Zan.
Thank you, Saroja. Thank you, everybody, for coming to our annual conference. Next time, we'll make sure to arrange a better weather. I don't know if we have the 1-800 number to dial somewhere that we can make arrangement better. But thank you for the people who are coming, who are staying. It's really my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. I get, my colleague, faculty, Saroja, and Kevin, and Greg, they did all the work, but I got this glory introduce the keynote speakers. I feel a little guilty, but I'm going to enjoy this moment. Our keynote speaker today is Carol Boudreau. She is a lawyer and land tenure and resource rights expert with 2 decades of experience as a researcher and development practitioner. That's a tons of experience. That's tons, right? I'm just reflecting on reading this. Throughout her career, she has supported improvement to the land tenure and resource rights of people and the community around the world, not just America, with a strong focus on women's land rights and sub-Saharan Africa. Her research concentrates on analysis of property and land tenure system and the responsible land-based investment. She has published more than 30 articles, book chapters, policy documents, and monograph on property rights. Mrs. Boudreau is leading author of USAID Operational Guidelines for Responsible Land-Based Investment, a tool for private sector investors in the commercial agriculture sector. She co-chairs the Sustainable Development Solution Network on the good governance of extractive and land resources. Mrs. Boudreau is currently land tenure and resource rights practice lead at the Cloudburst Group. She previously served as Africa lead tenure specialist at USAID and as assistant dean at the George Mason University's School of Law. Please join me in welcome Carol. Thank you.
Thank you all. Those of you who have stayed with us, I also thank you for sticking it out today. It's such a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank Greg especially for inviting me. Thank you to Saroja also for including me in this wonderful day's events. Thanks to St. Mary's. What a beautiful campus. I've never been here before. It's absolutely lovely. And it was great to see the university as well. So a little bit like Catherine, you can tell I'm an insider-outsider. Have done a lot of different things. I like to say I've seen international development from many different sides, from the academic side, from inside government, and from outside government, now working for governments. So I'll be sharing with you some of my experiences also as an insider-outsider. So we've heard today through the course of the 2 panels a bit about the appropriate role of businesses in recognizing, respecting, and supporting the human rights of people with whom they work either in supply chains or who they impact through their corporate operations. This corporate obligation is increasingly recognized as critical to promote sustainability, to meet ESG directives, to comply with legislation, to ensure social license to operate, and to mitigate the potential on the corporation side for both financial and reputational harms. Businesses, and not just those that are working to align their activities with the UN guiding principles, are facing increasing pressure from lenders, from consumers, from employees, this is an important component, from activist investors, and from civil society, to go beyond what maybe Catherine would have learned in business school a couple of years ago about the importance of taking care of stockholders and increasingly focusing on how do you take good care of your shareholders, or excuse me, of your stakeholders as well. And we had the pleasure of hearing, I think, some powerful examples of how this is happening today. I was really impressed by the NUMMI discussion on this last panel. But now at the end of the day, as I stand between you and networking and I stand between you and dinner, what I'm going to do is discuss an issue that I think is foundational to human dignity, it's foundational to human flourishing, but I think it's actually often overlooked. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time today discussing an issue that I think is critical to the business and human rights agenda, but maybe doesn't get quite as much attention as some of the other issues like employment issues, for example. And so that'll get me to the topic of my talk for today, which is From Wrongs to Rights, Why Land Rights Should Be at the Center of the Business and Human Rights Agenda. All right, so let's start with the problem. Today, around the world, there are 2.5 billion smallholder farmers and their families working, relying on agriculture on a small plot of land for their primary livelihood. In fact, 80% of the world's food that's consumed in the developing world is produced locally, mostly by these smallholder farmers and their families. 2.5 billion people, 2.5 billion jacks around the world. Many other people depend on forests and forest resources in order to make a living. And as the world continues to urbanize, even though the proportion of people who are living in informal settlements or in slums has declined, nearly 875 million people still live, work, and go to school in these informal settlements. In much of the developing world, then, the poorest people are the most dependent upon land as the critical productive asset that they hold. They need it to create a livelihood. They need it for shelter. Yet for millions upon millions of people around the world who depend upon land, their rights to access and use land can be extremely tenuous. One important part of this problem is that 70% of the world's land today is not documented. That gap that exists between the amount of land that people and communities claim as theirs and the percentage of land that's formally recognized as theirs, it isn't just a technical problem. You might think, oh, this is a land administration problem and it can be dealt with by land administrators in a very technocratic way. That is not right. This is not just a technical problem. This is a pressing human rights problem. So what I want to do for the rest of my time with you today is talk about why, and what the causes are of this problem, and why businesses should be willing to address this problem, and what they can do to address the problem, because there are good solutions for this problem. So why are land rights tenuous? Why are they insecure for literally billions of people around the world today? All right, so part of the problem is demand-driven. There is increasing, and there has been since 2007, 2008 in the food crisis, there's increasing demand for fertile land for farming, fertile land for ranching. There's increasing demand for land that has water resources on it that can also be used for agriculture. There's increasing demand for renewable energy projects. Solar farms take up a lot of space. Wind farms can take up a fair amount of space. There's demand for land for infrastructure development, building roads, building dams, et cetera, for urban expansion as cities grow, the boundaries of cities move out, and of course there's demand for land for things like mining and extractives. Demand for all of these land uses has been increasing, it hasn't been shrinking. Asset managers, natural resource firms, agricultural commodity suppliers, and energy companies are looking for land to grow and export food, to build solar or wind farms, to build highways, railroads, apartments, housing, and to extract minerals, oil, and gas. But the important issue here is that much of the land that firms are looking to acquire today is both inhabited and used. It is not vacant, it is not unused by local people. A study by the Rights and Resources Initiative has found that as much as 93% of all investment sites, 93% of all investment sites in the developing world are inhabited. This might not be a problem. It really might not. It might actually be a great economic opportunity, a really desired economic opportunity, if local people could contract directly with firms to sell or lease the land that they consider to be theirs. Could be an interesting source of income for communities. But in most cases, they can't. They're not allowed to do that. Remember the 70% number from just a moment ago? In most developing countries, poor people do not have legal documentation proving land is theirs. Or they don't have the legal right to lease or sell land to outsiders. So despite living on land sometimes for centuries, oftentimes for decades, local people are not recognized as legitimate landowners. And this lack of legal recognition puts men, women, and children at risk. Women face special challenges when it comes to land, as do Indigenous people. We heard a little bit about Indigenous peoples when Kelly was talking. Both groups are vulnerable to displacement. They're vulnerable to land grabbing. And land grabbing can happen at multiple levels. Women are particularly vulnerable to land grabbing by family members. If a husband dies, the husband's family will, in certain parts of the world, kick the wife out. Or force her to marry her brother-in-law in order for her to stay on the land. People are vulnerable at the national level. Local elites, powerful local people, can push less powerful people off of land. And at the international level, people can be vulnerable, women, Indigenous peoples particularly, when companies come into a country, don't understand the local land environment, contract with the government, and don't engage with local communities to try to understand what is the on-the-ground reality of land holding in a particular place. And so women, men, children are vulnerable, Indigenous peoples are vulnerable, but these risks that they face flow directly to companies as well. Companies that acquire land or work with suppliers who use land in places where local land rights are insecure need to understand. I think this was a message that came through several of the presentations, especially in the last panel. These companies need to understand that their actions can displace people and can upend communities. When land rights aren't recognized and enforced, wrongs often follow. So I'm going to talk to you for a moment about why land rights tend not to be enforced in the developing world, so bear with me through this for just a couple of moments. Why are these rights not enforced? We kind of take these rights for granted. We assume that if we have a home, an apartment, we own a piece of property somewhere, it's not the case that someone can come along tomorrow and throw Jack off his land. Jack understands that his land is going to be his as long as he's acquired it in a legally valid way. This isn't the case in many parts of the world. So one first-level problem that some of you will be aware of is that in countries all across, especially sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, it's actually the government that formally owns the land. And I mean all the land. The government owns the land in the country. The president may have vested, typically in him, the authority to hold the land as a trustee for the people. But in essence, the government is the monopoly owner of land in countries. At the same time, local people, especially those living in rural areas, continue to hold land rights under traditional or customary systems that have existed in some cases for centuries. Governments might provide local people with use rights to land, but as I've discussed now, only a minority of people have actually registered their rights and received some documentation that proves they have a claim over land. So why is there this big gap in formal recognition of land rights? There actually are several reasons. The first reason is that too few people understand what their rights are. They don't really understand what rights they hold over land and other kinds of property. Land administration systems, this is like a wonky thing, so excuse the wonkiness. They're just too complicated with too many steps to follow. So if you try to register a parcel of land in a typical developing world country, you may have to go through 8 to 17 steps. Each one of those steps rife with opportunities for corruption. Because of this, it's a very complicated system. It makes it very expensive for most poor people to actually go through the entirety of the system. The requirements for registering land might include some kind of particularly precise surveying. Getting a surveyor out to your farm can be nearly impossible. In some countries, there might be 25 surveyors, 25 licensed surveyors who are supposed to cover the entire country. This is only the slightest of exaggeration for a country like Tanzania, where I think there actually are a few more. Maybe there are 40 professionally licensed surveyors in the country. In other words, there's just not enough folks to do the work. Services are also usually too far away for many rural people. You might have to travel to a capital city to complete the process of applying for land and complete your registration. That can be very costly, so it's another additional cost for registering land. So people don't do it. They just don't they don't go through the whole process of formally registering their rights. They don't even know that they're supposed to formally register their rights. And problems are even worse for women, because on top of all these formal barriers to registering and securing rights over property, women face discriminatory social norms and social practices that make it difficult for them to exercise the rights they do hold. In over 100 countries today, there are discriminatory laws or practices related to women's property rights, and it is literally the case today that in some countries, women are still routinely viewed as property, and so not capable of being property owners. Okay, so put all these problems together. That's a lot of problems for me to have walked through with you, and it means that formal land records and maps, the one you're going to find in a cadastral office, the one you're going to find in a registry office, they do not reflect on-the-ground realities and claims. So when investors, when growers, when operators acquire rights to land in the developing world, they will deal with that formal system, but they're typically dealing with a system that's out of date and that's inaccurate. And so what do they need to do? They need to go to local council, talk with local council, go through a due diligence process that tries to sort of uncover what that on-the-ground reality is. All right, well, that's a good step in the due diligence process, but if local council does not understand the customary legal system, local council will also not be able to give an investor or an operator the guidance they need to understand who is living on land, who has what claims to land. Because governments in most countries in the developing world has the primary authority to negotiate land transfers and concessions, businesses may operate according to the letter of the law, not realizing that there actually is a whole nother law that guides most land relations in the developing world. A company like NUMI, maybe the NUMI people understand this, but those companies that Catherine was talking about who are in the shadows may not even realize there's a customary land system at work in a country where they're operating or hoping to operate. Which means that if what they're thinking about doing is complying with the formal law, that can be a necessary, but it's typically not a sufficient condition to reduce land risks that they're going to face. And the problem is that without secure land and property rights, without dependable and impartial enforcement mechanisms, another major problem around land risks in the developing world, without the opportunity to contract with investors, individuals and communities lose out. And here's where we get to the human rights part. Investments take place, concessions are issued, land is transferred, the government is usually signing off on it, and what happens to the people whose land which has been used, right? Remember I told you 93% of concessions in the developing world are inhabited. What happens to those people in those communities? Here's what happens. They lose homes, threatening their right to adequate housing. They lose the fields they depend upon to feed themselves and their family. So rights to an adequate standard of living can be lost. They lose access to water that they need for household use, to grow crops, to water their animals. They lose access to things that we don't really think about, but we should be thinking about, like access to medicinal herbs that they can use for medicine. They lose access to sacred places like graves. People are arrested, very common. They're jailed for protesting land transfers, and lives can be lost. Add all this up, what does it equal? It equals a lot of what we were talking about in the first session this morning, I think. Human dignity is lost People cannot feed themselves, they cannot shelter themselves, they cannot take care of their children, they're at risk of illness. And again, and sometimes lives are actually lost. So responsible businesses, sustainable businesses need to be aware of, and they need to avoid these kinds of risks, which can damage assets, finances, and reputation. So hopefully it's a little bit clearer now why insecure land rights are actually a business and human rights problem for companies. But I'm going to state it even more bluntly. The land in many developing world countries creates significant and material ESG risks, as well as sustainability and human rights risks. Governments are primarily responsible for the problem. They're the ones that continue to maintain weak land environments. But for companies, when land risks exist for companies when, number one, they don't recognize that customary landholders do have, in many situations, legitimate, valid claims over land. And it's not just the chiefs or the headmen who have these claims. It's women and men who hold rights under customary law. Land risk exists for companies when they don't engage in a meaningful way with local peoples who make these claims. These risks exist when companies don't map and inventory claims alongside and with community members to understand what it is they're claiming, which assets, where, at what times of the year, and when they don't work with communities to mitigate negative livelihood, environmental, and social impacts associated with land transfers. Now, so it's important to say that, of course, some firms do have incentives to address these issues. Companies that work with development finance institutions like the IFC, these companies are going to be attentive to the IFC's performance standard, which will hold them up to a higher standard. Or companies that work with responsible investors may have different standards that they're working to meet. But many other companies are going to be those companies in the shadows. They aren't going to be doing enough to identify and address land risks, whether it's through corporate due diligence or as part of their sustainability commitments. And this is a problem because these risks are not isolated. These are widespread risks, and they're costly risks. When local people, and actually it's too bad Kelly left because I'm sure she could speak to this pretty directly. When local people are left out of negotiations, when governments and firms provide inadequate resettlement options, when they fail to address environmental concerns or provide few benefits, what does this lead to? We've seen it over and over again. It leads to protests, it leads to work stoppages, it leads to property damage, it can lead to site invasions, and it leads to violence. Over the past few years, hundreds of people have been jailed and killed defending their land and environmental rights. The United Nations has called this a silent epidemic. A 2016 analysis of 362 land-based investments around the world finds that the incidence of protests involving land rights is only rising. More communities are connecting with other communities, with advocates, and with civil society to demand opportunities for meaningful consultation when land rights are transferred. Remember, people think about this as their land. They've been living on the land, it's their property, they've been using it, again, not just for years, not just for decades, in some cases for centuries. The report also finds that up to a third of investments faced a severe impact from land risks, and by severe impact, that could mean suspension of a project, large fines, or even cancellation of a project. Coca-Cola had to cancel a $24 million investment in a bottling operation in India not so long ago because the company didn't realize that the land it was using for the facility was actually occupied by local people, and it led to such protests that the project actually had to be canceled. All right, so the driver for most disputes, most of these protests, was actually not identified as compensation. It's not how much money is the company giving to the local communities. That's not what's driving most of the protests. Instead, what's driving the majority of protests is displacement, which means loss of homes, loss of livelihood. That drove 46% of protests, followed by concerns over environmental harms at 26%. So what I'm going to do now for just a few moments is give you one example, just one, that I hope helps to underscore why this problem should rightly be considered a human rights issue. So the case I'm going to talk to you about is in Paraguay. In the early 1990s, an indigenous community called the Sohoyamaxa asked the government of Paraguay to return 15,000 hectares of land in the northeast Chaco region of the country to them. The land was being used as a private cattle ranch. Cattle estates were created in Paraguay at the beginning of the 20th century as investments, for sure, but also to pacify and evangelize indigenous peoples who then became laborers on ranches. Unfortunately, the efforts by the government to reach a settlement between the company and the community didn't work. The firm that was running the cattle ranch maintained it had acquired the land lawfully. It had a title to the land, and so it was the rightful owner of the land. However, government courts issued an injunction telling the company that it needed to stop deforesting the land, right? So cattle ranching is a significant deforester of property. You need to cut down the trees to let the cows get around to the grass and eat the grass. And while negotiations dragged on between the government and the community and the company, eventually the land was sold to new owners. Okay, so the land is now held by a different private sector firm. Protesting community members were forced off the ranch, and they moved to a narrow strip of land alongside a highway. But on this land, this narrow strip of land alongside a highway, they couldn't grow food. They didn't have access to clean drinking water. They didn't have access to any medical care or sanitation. So community members became sick, and a significant number of them actually passed away. Finally, with no resolution at the national level, the case is dragging on and on. You can imagine the cattle ranchers more powerful actors than the indigenous community. The government's in a quandary. What are we going to do about this? And actually, this case started before significant attention at the international level to the rights of indigenous people. So there's no resolution at the national level of this case. The case was eventually taken to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, where the community claimed that through inaction, the government violated their rights, including rights to life, rights to humane treatment, rights to a fair trial, rights to non-discrimination, and their rights to property. In 2006, the court unanimously held that the government, in fact, did violate those rights by not addressing the community's land claims. It upheld the community's right to property and identified violations of the right to life and rights of the child associated with community members living in really desperate conditions along the side of this road. So what did the court do? The court ordered the government to return the Sohoyamaxa's land. But it wasn't until 2014, so it took nearly a decade, for the president of Paraguay to enact a new law transferring 55 square miles of territory in the Chaco region back to the Sohoyamaxa. And what happened to the cattle ranch? It was expropriated. It was taken away. Private cattle ranchers lose their investment. So I'm going to take a minute and unpack this case for you. In this case, the government clearly, under its own law and under international law, had a right to protect, had an obligation to protect the human rights of its citizens, including the indigenous peoples who were citizens, and including the property rights of those people. The difficult question for the government to address was, did the indigenous community have a legitimate claim to the land? Because, of course, the formal right to the land was held by the ranchers. For the cattle ranching company, it's important to note that the second cattle ranching company bought into a troubled situation. When they bought the land, they understood the land's ownership was under dispute. This created what we call a legacy land issue. In many cases, brownfield investments can be particularly challenging when it comes to legacy land issues. They can be as challenging as creating new greenfield investments. And the buyer probably assumed that by having a formal government-issued title to the land, they had done all they needed to do to continue ranching and making and earning money. But they were wrong. They were wrong. They spent years litigating a claim that they eventually lost. So increasingly, commodity suppliers, energy producers, and infrastructure developers who assume that just by acquiring a legal title document from a country to land for a project, that you will be able to move forward without any problems with that project will also be wrong, because it's not enough in many countries. In this case, the Sohoyamaxa case, it doesn't seem like there was much in the way of community engagement efforts. They were negligible at best. It's not clear how much good faith there was in the negotiations, and negotiations certainly didn't move forward in a timely manner. And in the meantime, without access to land and water, communities suffered real harms. They lost their property rights. This led to a loss of other fundamental human rights, including the right to life. And interestingly, today, land risk continues in the Chaco region. Cattle ranching has been expanding. Large-scale production of soya is expanding. Smallholders continue to lose land. This leads to violence. In 2012, 17 people, farmers and police, were killed in a dispute over land rights. So that's just one case. I'm cherry-picking one case for you. But for me, this case is useful because it illustrates, at least to me it illustrates, how land rights are intimately related to the exercise of other recognized human rights. And it demonstrates why ignoring land and property rights can lead to severe harms for local people and at the same time severely impact investments in business operations. It's not hard, right, to imagine how examples like this could affect consumer-facing companies and their investors. So imagine if that cattle ranch was supplying a major restaurant chain here in the US. What would have happened? Some of the Oxfam people would have been on top of that. Or imagine if soy producers were responsible for displacing women and children from their homes so kids couldn't go to school anymore or get access to medical care. And unfortunately, I'm here to tell you that stories like this are playing out today. Women and men today are protesting mining projects in Guatemala and Ecuador. They're protesting wind projects in Oaxaca. They're protesting forestry investments in Cambodia and Mozambique. Palm oil production in Indonesia and Liberia, hydropower in Sumatra. They're protesting the expansion of conservation areas in Tanzania, and they're protesting oil production in northwest Kenya. In each one of these cases, land rights are at the heart of the controversy. Okay, so for some of you, there are a few lawyers left in the room. For some of you, you might be asking, all right, Carol, but are land rights and property rights really human rights? And the short answer to that question is, it depends who you ask. And I'm glad you're asking me. So today, there actually is no fundamental right under international law to access and use land. And when we talk about a right to land, that's what folks like me mean, a right to access and use land. There is a human right to property, though, and certain groups have recognized rights over land. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And so to get to the longer answer might be this. The notion of land rights, I think, is evolving. And I expect that 5 to 10 years from now, they'll be reasonably widely recognized. And so if you were a responsible company, maybe like Numi, if you were a responsible company, you'd be wise to get ahead of this issue and start thinking about how you, as a corporate responsible actor, could address the problem of land rights in your supply chain or in your corporate activities. So here's what we do know. Several of the folks who've talked this afternoon have talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that keystone, that lodestone that guides a lot of the actions that we've been discussing today. Article 17 of the Universal Declaration says, everyone has the right to own property alone and in association with others. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his, implied parenthetical, her, property. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 1. All people have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. All peoples may, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to any obligations arising out of international economic cooperation. If your land is not part of your natural wealth, part of your resources, I don't know what is. And if the government controls the disposition, that would seem to be a problem under this covenant. ILO Convention 169 recognizes the rights of indigenous people to own and possess land that they traditionally occupy and to use and manage the surface-level natural resources found on their land. The convention requires states to take measures to identify these lands, and it introduces the idea of FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. It's important to note, though, that this convention is not widely ratified. It doesn't have that many signatories. UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also a non-binding document, Article 26. Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used and acquired. So you can see a growing, changing sense that it's important to recognize the land, territorial rights of indigenous peoples, their rights over resources. CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Discrimination Against Women. Article 14 gives rural women rights to land. Article 15 notes that women shall have equality with men before the law, and this includes in civil matters a legal capacity identical to that of men. They shall give women equal rights to conclude contracts and administer property. And then Article 16 goes on to give women equal rights to marital property as well. So in addition, so those are the international level documents. I'm building my case. Here's the evidence base. There are documents that talk about this. In addition, of course, there are regional human rights instruments that protect rights to property. We saw that in the case of the Sohaya Maksa. And just this past year, a really interesting case. African countries have been very hesitant to recognize rights of indigenous peoples for a variety of reasons. But just this past year, in 2017, the African Court on Human and People's Rights recognized the right to land in its landmark case involving the government of Kenya and the Ogiek people. The government of Kenya had displaced the Ogiek out of the Mau forest. The government said this was required for environmental reasons, and the Ogiek said, no, you're really dispossessing us of our cultural heritage and our livelihoods. The Europeans, interestingly enough, the European Convention on Human Rights has provided much less protection for land rights. There are some indigenous communities in Europe, including the Sami in the Scandinavian area, and we forget about this, like I totally always forget about this, but Greenland is actually covered by the European Convention on Human Rights because Denmark, I think, is technically in charge of Greenland. And there are indigenous peoples in Greenland. No cases brought by indigenous peoples have succeeded in the European court. However, it could be that those cases came a little bit too early. But interestingly, national laws also provide for equal treatment before the law and rights to property. And so increasingly, there's this very interesting jurisdictional development that's taking place in common law Commonwealth countries, countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand. These governments have issued really important decisions over the last 20 years recognizing particularly indigenous land claims and providing more secure rights over natural resources and land itself to these communities so that the communities can make decisions about how to use the resources and how to manage and engage with investors who wish to use those resources in a productive manner. And that's great. That's empowering. The communities now are directly engaged with a variety of different companies. Hydro, for example, in British Columbia. Hydroelectric companies are engaging directly with indigenous communities to build facilities on lands that are recognized as indigenous lands and then providing benefits back to the communities, engaging the communities as partners in business ventures rather than in sort of the typical international development framework of beneficiaries who need to be given to in a passive way. The great thing about this devolutionary process is that it engages communities as active partners rather than passive recipients. And there are a number of soft international law documents that encourage states and businesses also to recognize and respect legitimate land rights. I'll just talk about a couple of these. The most important one are the voluntary guidelines on the, this is a long title, so just bear with me. The voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests in the context of national food security. So a long title, I call them the VGGT. So that exists. The VGGT are the first international law level document that recognizes a legitimate land rights, and importantly recognizes rights to customary land and recognizes the rights of women to be, women, not just rural women, to be co-equal with that of men. So the VGGT, there's been a big push to implement them and socialize them, both in the private sector and among governments. They were passed unanimously in 2012. They were followed by something called the Principles for Responsible Investment in Agriculture and Food Systems. Its acronym is the RIE. The RIE includes, by reference, the VGGT. We have the OECD's guidelines for multinational enterprises, and now we have the SDGs. And we had one quick mention of the SDGs earlier today. I want to point out that five of the 17 goals address land in some way. So that's SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, SDG 5 on gender equality, SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities, and SDG 15, life on land. Each one of these 5 goals has at least one or more indicators addressing the need to recognize or protect land and land rights. Okay, everyone, take a deep breath with me. That was a lot about the problems. There are a lot of problems. So now I'm going to very briefly talk about some solutions. We can tell from listening to the last panel that stakeholders are asking companies questions like the following. Are you addressing human rights concerns in your operations? How are you doing that? Show me specifically. What are you doing? What about your supplies? Are they sourced in a sustainable way, in a way that respects human rights? Here's a number that I find astonishing, but you business school people will not find this astonishing. In 2016, in the United States, professional managers invested nearly $9 trillion, with a T, dollars in sustainable, responsible, or impact investing, SRI investing. $9 trillion here in the US. That's a 33% increase since 2014. Globally, the figure is 23 trillion, and that's a 25% increase since 2014, and that's coming from the Global Sustainable Investment Review. So we know there are investors that want to see responsible projects. We know there are consumers that want to see responsible projects. We know there are employees that want to see responsible projects, and we know that there are companies that are pursuing responsible projects. But the point of my talk is to tell you that if local land rights aren't taken into account, if local people who are supplying your soy or your cocoa or your cane for your sugar, or if local people have been displaced to make room for the production of oil or natural gas, if you don't have a grievance mechanism in place that addresses land issues, then your investments are not going to be considered responsible, and SRI funding may not be available. But the good news is there are strategies and there are actions companies can take to mitigate land risk. There are practical steps that you can take to fix this problem. I'm not going to say it's a super easy problem, but I am going to say incrementally it's a problem that companies can deal with. So first, it's just important to recognize that land rights are a component of ESIA's, environmental social impacts, and they should be an important part of human rights due diligence. The risks aren't going to go away by ignoring them. You have to be able to understand where they exist and then over time track and monitor what changes with regard to these risks. Next, we talked a little bit about companies creating corporate policies and guidelines. Companies need to create these policies and guidelines with regard to how they acquire land or how their suppliers acquire land. And several major firms have already done this, or they're in the process of doing this. Some firms that already have in place corporate policies on land acquisitions that do not land acquisitions done in a responsible way to avoid human rights violations include Coca-Cola, Ilovo Sugar. Ilovo is the largest producer of sugar in Africa. Ilovo was recently purchased, so their parent company, I'm not sure if the parent company has made the same commitment. Nestle's made a commitment along these lines, so has Unilever, and I added in NUMI because I saw that land rights was part of the NUMI list of issues they take account of. So having a policy around land rights and not particularly a policy around not wrongfully displacing local people who have legitimate claims is important. Some sectoral certification initiatives recognize the importance of respecting local land rights. These include things like Bonsucro for the sugar sector, the Forest Stewardship Council, the Rainforest Alliance, and the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. Meeting sectoral certification requirements can help reduce land risks, but again, they're voluntary and so maybe don't have quite as much force as we might like. Companies can include land rights as a risk factor in their risk management strategies. Tracking incidence and severity of land conflicts can help firms identify where and how they need to spend resources. Operationalizing commitments should involve some of the following things. Some of the panelists before me talked a little bit about this. It should include inclusive engagement at the community level with women and with men to understand what rights they claim, to what resources, at what times of the year, and to identify and understand what concerns a project raises for these people. I want to emphasize this. It is not good enough to talk to the chief. The chief may be self-dealing. The chief might be great. Maybe the chief is a fabulous guy. But the chief could also just be a human being who sees an investment, especially with one of those shadow companies, as an opportunity for personal enrichment. So companies that are serious about engagement and community engagement particularly need to talk to men and women because men and women hold different rights over resources. If you just talk to the men, you're not going to capture the resources that women claim. If you don't talk to pastoralists who come in and move through your area at a particular time of the year, you could end up having problems with pastoralists who lose access to pastures or water. So you have to talk to a broad array of stakeholders. And this discussion needs to keep going on. So I've seen a number of different companies who get upset because they start a land-based investment, they hold a workshop, they bring some people together, they talk with them, they've got someone, kind of like me, talking at people, probably in English or French or German, not necessarily speaking the local language, or maybe speaking the colonial language but not speaking the local language. And that's it. That's what community engagement looks like. It's a workshop with some people once. That's not good enough. You have to go back and talk to people more than once. Stay engaged with local communities. Engagement can also engagement should also include participatory mapping exercises. This is like a development language. This sounds like development language lingo, but it's really not that difficult. You sit down with the community members and you literally draw on a piece of paper where the boundaries of their territory are. And you draw out the things with them. Have them draw out what's important for them. Where's the forest that they use to get firewood? Where are the pastures they use for their animals? Where's the water sources that they use? Where are the graves that are important to them? It's not high tech, it's low tech, doesn't cost a ton of money, takes a little bit of time, but it's critically important. Here's the exciting thing. In some cases, companies can actually help local people map and record their land rights to fill that capacity gap that I mentioned earlier, that gap that hobbles so many governments. This is so exciting now because as the costs of GIS technology and mapping technologies come down, more people and more companies can use things like GPS-enabled smartphones or tablets, drones, crowdsourcing platforms, and satellite imagery to identify parcel boundaries and important local sites. And I myself have been involved in several different projects, including one that's just finishing up now with Alovo Sugar that involve the company providing some staff supporting efforts to go out and map smallholder parcels around one of their estates in Mozambique. As a result of doing the project, the company, along with a donor agency, in this case it was USAID, are going to provide certificates, land certificates to over 1,800 parcels around this estate. And what does this mean? This is not so important necessarily for the company in one sense. What this will do is help reduce conflicts between community members who exist outside the plantation borders. It will also help the company meet its commitment to have no land grabbing in its supply chain, because now the company will legitimately be able to say, hey, that cane supplier I'm working with She actually has a legitimate claim. We went out and mapped it, we recorded it, and the community members who are her neighbors validated it. It's not us, the company, that validated this claim. It's the neighbors of the woman who's growing cane who validated her claim. She's legitimate to be there. We didn't grab her land from her. No other local elite person grabbed the land from her. So this is really exciting. Firms with land-based operations also, though, need to do things like create grievance mechanisms that address land disputes. And finally, you have to monitor and evaluate, report on your progress on land issues in local languages when that's possible. So I'm going to sum up now, because again, I'm mindful that I am between you and the end of the day. I want to first of all acknowledge that this isn't easy work. Part of the reason why land is still a difficult issue to work on is because it's hard. Land is highly politicized. It's a highly politicized issue because land is power. The person or the institution that controls land has a lot of power over the people who live on, use, access that land. So when you start to change the land holding dynamics, you can create some upsetment among the powers that be. Land environments are, I will say it bluntly, dysfunctional in many countries because the people who manage those systems have incentives to keep it that way, because they benefit from the dysfunction. They can get access to those people, the jacks. They can get access to Jack's land without necessarily having to pay Jack. That is bad for the average person in the country. It's good for the people in power who manage the land system. They benefit. It's not the local people on the ground. So this is difficult work. I acknowledge it. But importantly, especially with technology changes, this is work that can be done incrementally. I also want to acknowledge that it can be costly for companies to add one more thing onto their due diligence list. There's a lot of stuff companies already have to do. Now you've got people like me coming along and saying, hey, there's something else you need to be thinking about. Is that, so I'm just going to pick on NUMMI for a second. I'm not picking on you, I'm just using your sector. Because NUMMI's, we heard they're awesome. But what about all those other tea companies out there? What if the tea plantation decides it wants to expand and grow a little bit more tea and doesn't think about displacing the people who are using that land for some other purpose? If they have good political connections, they can probably do that. If they're not a responsible company, they can probably do that. Okay, so it's difficult, it can be costly doing the kind of stuff, the kind of additional due diligence I'm talking about can be costly. And then here's something else I want to acknowledge. I want to acknowledge it's not the role of the private sector to be the government. And sometimes we forget this. Sometimes we think the private sector is so powerful, it can do so much. Why can't it just step in and fill this 10-year gap? Why can't it fill the capacity gap? The private sector has GIS specialists. Why can't they go out and map all the land? Well, it's not really their job to do that, right? In a way, it's the job of the government to do that. But the governments are not well governed, they don't have resources, they're always competing resources. Sure, the government of Tanzania could maybe hire more surveyors, but if they hire more surveyors and they're on the public roles for employment, maybe they can't hire doctors. And maybe land, in some ways, isn't the most important thing. To me, land is at the center of so much. But governments are always making trade-offs. And companies really can't completely fill this role. But companies can, in some situations, like the one I talked about a moment ago with Olovo, they can partner with donor organizations, they can partner with civil society organizations, and they can partner with governments to help address some of the capacity gaps. And this kind of investment in helping to fill these gaps, it can pay dividends in terms of enhancing local security. It can help in terms of giving people different, better incentives to improve their productivity. Professor Buckley talked about this, once I have a secure right to my property, I am much more likely to do what needs to be done to make it a productive piece of property. And I'm going to be a better supplier for you, for your supply chain. But also importantly, doing this kind of work helps reduce conflict over land, conflict among community members and conflict between communities and companies. And so it helps to improve sustainability. By putting land rights squarely at the center of the Business and Human Rights Committee, agenda, by taking the land rights of those millions, billions, literally billions, of men, women, and children around the world who today are at risk, by taking their needs into account, by addressing those needs and their concerns, and their desire, they desire to securely hold their land and property. Who doesn't? Who doesn't desire to have a sense that your land is yours and you're safe on it, that your home is yours and you're safe on it? By engaging on this issue, companies can reduce risks for themselves, they can reduce risks for local people. And here's like the takeaway. Companies can help protect that one critical asset that people around the world depend upon, helping them to flourish, helping them to live more complete lives. That asset is the ground under their feet. Thank you so much for your attention.
So we come to the end of today's, the fourth conference, and thank you so much for those who stuck around or who've just come for this particular session. So I want to thank a lot of people. Thank you, Carol, the other speakers from both panels. Some of you are still around, some have gone away, but thank you. I'd also like to take some time to thank my colleagues who have shaped this conference, Associate Director Kevin McGarry and Greg, both of them. And yeah. So I know the speakers, many of them have come from far away, from the other side of the country, a few hours down from the South Bay, which is almost like coming from the other side of the country, especially during the rain. So again, thank you so much. I'd like to thank Zan, as usual, for his support in the conference. I wish more people were around. But for those of you, especially those teaching ethics, this is videotaped, so you can show your students. And it will be posted on the Elfenworks site. So one more reason to keep checking our website. To the students who are present here for bonus points or because you're interested in the topic, either way, thank you for sticking around and for taking notes. Yeah. And now, a conference like this, unless you're actually doing this preparation, like you just don't know how, a lot of little details. And Kathy Warren from the Dean's office, she's the Executive Director of Finance, so she holds the money bag. So I'm always going to her. Yeah, so thank you, Kathy. And Robin, she's not here. Many of you probably, the speakers, have heard from her. She's done an amazing job, and people who've been sitting outside helping us, Desta and Elaine, and a lot of people, if I forgot to thank you, I'm sorry. It's, maybe the end of the day, and I have an 8 a.m. class tomorrow. So, thanks to everyone. And so I hope the 5th annual, Yeah, Lauren, I thanked you in the beginning. Thank you again. We couldn't have done this without you. Again, next year, I hope all of you mark your calendars for around this time of the year, and you're able to come for the 5th annual conference as well. So with that, we have food at the back, and we'll have some networking time. And if you have questions for any of the speakers, including Carol, this is a great time to be talking and networking. So thank you again. And yeah.